Babe, isn't that the president?
What is my ex-wife doing with the president? Don't panic, my queen. You're with the president now.
He invited his ex-wife to his wedding to shame her. She arrived with the president. Esteemed viewers, welcome to Luxurious True Life Stories. Please like and subscribe for more captivating luxury true stories. Let's get into the story. Frank Desmond lived by mirrors. Every morning began with the same ritual: tailored suit, perfect tie, measured smile. His apartment overlooked the financial district, but the view mattered less than the reflection in the glass doors. He believed success had a sound, applause, and he chased it daily. At his firm, colleagues respected his efficiency but never his warmth. Frank didn't notice. Respect and admiration were identical to him. His parents shaped him carefully. His father, Harold Desmond, judged emotions as weakness and measured worth by promotions. His mother, Lillian, corrected posture more often than she gave affection. Praise only came after achievement. As a child, Frank learned attention was earned, not given. By adulthood, he feared being ordinary more than being unhappy. Every handshake became performance. Every conversation became competition. That evening he attended a networking gala after a failed presentation. Investors dismissed his proposal politely, yet the polite smiles hurt more than anger. He stepped outside into heavy rain, unwilling to be seen disappointed. Wandering through nearby streets to avoid reporters, he pushed open an unlocked door to escape the storm, unaware he had entered a closed historical museum under restoration. Inside, dust and scaffolding replaced luxury. For the first time in years, nobody knew who he was. Sophia Clinton preferred quiet over praise. She spent her mornings inside unfinished spaces, abandoned theaters, libraries, museums, places others ignored, but she understood. Her hands were often dusty, her clothes simple, and her satisfaction came from restoring details nobody noticed. She lived with her widowed mother, Eleanor Clinton, in a small apartment filled with sketches and old photographs. Their dinners were slow conversations, not rushed schedules. Her father had once been a carpenter who repaired community buildings for free. After he passed, Sophia kept his tools carefully arranged in a wooden box. She believed buildings carried memories and deserved patience. While others chased modern luxury, she repaired carved railings and faded ceilings. Her dream was modest: restore spaces where people could feel safe without needing wealth to belong. That night she stayed late inside the museum, repainting delicate wall carvings under a single lamp while rain tapped the roof. When the entrance door suddenly opened, she turned, startled. A well-dressed man stood dripping water onto the marble floor, clearly out of place. She frowned before speaking. "Sorry, we're closed." Frank Desmond, unused to dismissal, looked around at the unfinished hall. For once, nobody recognized him, and strangely, he didn't correct her. Frank didn't leave immediately. Instead he stepped farther inside, studying the faded walls and wooden frames stacked along the corridor. The building carried a calm silence unfamiliar to him, a silence without expectations. Sophia watched carefully, assuming he was another careless visitor wandering into a workspace. She handed him a cloth without ceremony. "You're dripping everywhere. Either help or go." No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not rudely, simply without importance. Frank hesitated, then awkwardly wiped the water from the marble floor. His expensive shoes collected dust, and for the first time that day he stopped thinking about appearances. He asked what she was fixing. Sophia explained the carvings were over a century old and every line mattered. He listened, surprised at how passionately she spoke about something that brought no fame. They argued gently. Frank believed people valued buildings only when they were impressive. Sophia believed people valued places when they felt welcome. He insisted prestige created meaning. She replied meaning existed long before prestige. The conversation lasted longer than the rain. When it finally softened outside, Frank noticed he no longer felt irritated about his failed presentation. He thanked her, almost formally, then paused before leaving. Sophia shrugged. Only when something is worth finishing. Frank returned the next evening, though he told himself it was coincidence. He brought coffee, the expensive kind he usually offered clients, and placed it beside Sophia's ladder without announcement. She glanced at it, then at him. "You got lost again?" "Maybe," he replied, trying not to smile. Days turned into routine. After work he visited the museum, sometimes talking, sometimes simply watching her paint delicate lines across damaged patterns. Sophia never treated his job as impressive, only asked whether he enjoyed it. The question unsettled him. Enjoyment had never been part of his definition of success. Yet inside the unfinished halls, conversations felt unmeasured and strangely calm. Weeks later he suggested dinner. She agreed only after making him promise it wouldn't be somewhere extravagant. They ate at a small street cafe where nobody recognized him. Frank spoke more honestly than he ever had, not about achievements, but pressure. Sophia spoke about patience, about how restoration required accepting imperfections instead of hiding them. The difference between them felt balanced rather than distant. Their relationship grew quietly. No grand gestures, no announcements. One morning they stood inside a courthouse with 2 witnesses and signed marriage papers. Sophia smiled peacefully. Frank smiled proudly. As they stepped outside, she squeezed his hand simply because she was happy. He squeezed back, though somewhere inside, he imagined how impressed others would have been if they had seen it. Marriage began gently. Their apartment filled with small routines, shared breakfasts, late evening walks, quiet music while Sophia sketched beside the window. Frank discovered calm he had never scheduled. For a while, he left work earlier than usual just to sit with her while she described future restoration ideas. He didn't fully understand them, but he enjoyed how certain she sounded. Then his career shifted. A senior partner retired unexpectedly, and Frank was promoted into a prestigious division handling wealthy investors. The office changed instantly, larger meetings, louder conversations, sharper suits. Success finally approached the image he had chased for years. Invitations followed, galas, private clubs, executive gatherings. At one of those events he met Caroline Taylor. Caroline carried confidence like decoration. She was the daughter of a powerful corporate chairman and spoke the language of ambition fluently. She admired Frank's discipline and laughed at his structured routines. Around her, admiration returned, direct, visible, constant. Soon she began including him in elite circles that praised achievement above all else. Frank didn't notice how often he started describing his life without mentioning Sophia. Sophia sensed the change slowly. Frank came home later, answered messages during dinner, and replaced quiet evenings with social obligations. He encouraged her to attend events with him, but insisted she dress differently, more polished, more formal. She tried, uncomfortable in unfamiliar clothing, practicing conversations that felt rehearsed rather than real. At gatherings Caroline was always nearby, introducing Frank proudly as a rising figure. When people asked Sophia about her work, the conversations ended quickly. Restoration sounded unimpressive beside investments and influence. Frank didn't intend harm, yet he often redirected discussions toward his achievements, unintentionally leaving her standing silent beside him. At home the silence deepened. She spoke less about her project because he seemed distracted. He spoke more about future plans that never included her preferences. One night she placed her sketchbook aside and asked softly, "Are you still happy?" Frank answered automatically, "Of course. Everything's improving." She nodded, though she realized he meant his life, not their marriage. The corporate dinner was held in a grand glass hall overlooking the river. Sophia arrived beside Frank, carefully dressed the way he suggested, though she felt like a visitor inside someone else's evening. Conversations floated around investment numbers and acquisitions she didn't understand. She stayed close to him at first, but he was quickly surrounded by colleagues and Caroline, who moved through the room effortlessly. During dinner, Caroline smiled politely and asked Sophia about her work in a tone gentle enough to avoid accusation, yet sharp enough to draw attention. "So you repair old buildings? Small projects, right?" Several guests listened. Sophia explained restoration preserved history for communities, but their interest faded quickly. Caroline laughed lightly and redirected the conversation toward expanding luxury properties. The table followed her lead. Frank remained silent, focused on maintaining the discussion's momentum. Sophia understood in that moment she was no longer part of his world, only attached to it. On the ride home, Frank spoke enthusiastically about potential investors he impressed. She watched the city lights pass through the window and did not interrupt. When they reached the apartment, she removed her shoes slowly and said only, "You didn't notice?" Frank looked confused. She didn't explain further. Days passed in careful politeness. Neither argued loudly, yet distance grew clearer. Frank believed disagreements were temporary discomforts before success stabilized life. Sophia felt something permanent had shifted. They began living parallel routines, sharing space but not experiences. Small conversations replaced meaningful ones. One evening Frank returned home carrying documents instead of groceries. He spoke calmly, almost professionally. He explained their lifestyles no longer aligned and that both deserved environments suited to their futures. His tone held practicality, not anger. Sophia listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap. She asked no questions about Caroline. She only asked whether he was certain. The divorce was completed quickly. No dramatic confrontation, no raised voices. She packed her belongings into a few boxes and left the apartment as neatly as she had once entered his life. The next week she accepted a restoration contract in a quiet coastal town repairing an abandoned lighthouse. When her train departed, Frank did not attend the station. He had an early meeting. Sophia watched the city disappear through the window and breathed for what felt like the first time in months. The coastal town was small and patient. Wind replaced traffic noise, and the ocean moved without hurry. The lighthouse stood on a rocky edge, weathered and leaning slightly from years of neglect. Paint peeled from its walls, windows clouded by salt, stairs worn uneven by time. To Sophia it felt welcoming, a place allowed to age honestly instead of being polished for approval. She rented a modest room above a bakery run by Mrs. Dalton, a retired pianist who preferred conversations over customers. Each morning Sophia climbed the hill carrying tools, while fishermen greeted her casually, uninterested in her past. A teenage volunteer, Oliver Grant, offered to help after school, curious about the building's history. Together they cleaned, measured, and repaired beams under the sound of waves striking the rocks below. Work restored her rhythm. Evenings were quiet sketches beside open windows, not formal events. Nobody asked about status or income. They asked about progress. Weeks passed, and for the first time she noticed her thoughts no longer returned constantly to her marriage. The lighthouse required attention, and attention replaced regret. One afternoon she found someone sitting on the cliff path near the lighthouse. A man in simple clothes watched the horizon without impatience. He greeted her politely and asked whether the tower would function again. His voice was calm, careful with words. She explained the mechanism could be repaired, though it would take time. He returned the next day, and the next, never interfering, only observing. Sometimes he carried books about maritime history and asked questions about architecture. And like most visitors, he listened fully to her answers. He introduced himself only as Richard. There was no curiosity about her personal life, no praise, no judgment. Their conversations grew natural. He spoke about responsibility and solitude without explaining details. She spoke about rebuilding spaces and starting again. They shared tea on the steps while watching the sunset fade into the ocean. The quiet companionship felt steady, not intense. Sophia didn't wonder who he was. She only noticed she felt peaceful while he was there. Weeks passed before Richard's presence changed. One morning several black vehicles appeared at the bottom of the hill, stopping far from the lighthouse. Men in formal attire remained near them, speaking quietly into earpieces. Sophia noticed the tension immediately. Richard stood beside her on the steps, unusually hesitant. He explained simply. He was not just Richard, he was President Richard Charles. After years of public life and personal loss, he sometimes traveled privately to think without ceremony. The town had cooperated in silence to protect that privacy. Sophia listened without shock. The man beside her had never behaved differently from the one she knew yesterday. He apologized for not saying sooner, worried his title would change her comfort. She shook her head. His identity did not alter the conversations they shared, repairing lantern glass or watching storms approach. What mattered was consistency. He had always spoken gently and listened carefully. That steadiness meant more than status ever could. Their connection deepened gradually, built on ordinary days rather than dramatic gestures. Richard began helping with small repairs, learning to sand wood and polish metal rails. He never turned the work into symbolism. He simply enjoyed participating. Sophia discovered he valued quiet routines because public life rarely allowed them. Months later he spoke carefully, not as president but as a man seeking companionship. He asked whether she would consider building a life with him, privately, without changing her world. She did not answer immediately. She considered peace, trust, and how he never demanded she become someone else. They married quietly at a local civil office with Mrs. Dalton and Oliver as witnesses. No cameras, no announcement. Afterward they returned to the lighthouse and shared tea as usual. Their marriage felt less like a beginning and more like a continuation of calm understanding. Only a few officials knew. The world continued unaware. Meanwhile in the city, Frank Desmond's life accelerated. His engagement to Caroline Taylor became a social highlight, planned as an extravagant ceremony designed to attract attention. Interviews and announcements surrounded the event. The wedding promised influence and admiration, everything he once pursued. While reviewing the guest list, he paused at one name, Sophia Clinton. A quiet thought surfaced, closure through comparison. He convinced himself inviting her would prove he had advanced beyond the past. The invitation was written formally and sent without hesitation. Sophia received the envelope weeks later at the lighthouse. She read it calmly, neither angered nor shaken. That evening she showed Richard. He studied her expression and told her she owed no appearance to anyone. After a long silence she replied she did not want revenge, only certainty she had truly moved forward. She decided she would attend. The wedding venue shimmered with glass chandeliers and polished marble. Guests arrived in formal attire, filling the hall with conversation and expectation. Frank moved confidently through the crowd, greeting investors and dignitaries while photographers captured every smile. Caroline stood nearby in elegant white, receiving admiration she had carefully planned. Everything unfolded exactly as Frank imagined, visible success. Then the entrance doors opened again. Sophia stepped inside calmly, dressed simply but gracefully. Beside her walked Richard Charles, unmistakable despite the absence of ceremony. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The room shifted from celebration to stunned stillness as recognition spread from one table to another. Security personnel at the edges straightened instinctively while whispers grew louder than music. Frank stared, unable to disguise his reaction. The comparison he intended reversed instantly. There was no pity directed at Sophia, only quiet respect surrounding her presence. Richard greeted hosts politely as though attending any normal event. Caroline's confident smile faded, replaced by disbelief. The ceremony paused without instruction, every guest aware something irreversible had occurred. News traveled faster than the reception could recover. Phones appeared discreetly across the hall, messages sent before the couple even reached the seating area. Reporters gathered outside within minutes, sensing a story larger than the wedding. Inside, the atmosphere changed from admiration to curiosity. Caroline approached Frank quietly, asking whether he had known. His silence answered. She studied Sophia across the room, not angry, but thoughtful. The humiliation she expected Sophia to feel instead settled over the hosts of the event. Guests discussed character rather than luxury decorations. Richard spoke courteously with attendees, never referencing the past. Sophia remained composed, neither triumphant nor uncomfortable. Her calm presence emphasized the contrast more than any confrontation could have. The ceremony resumed briefly but lacked conviction, and the celebration never regained its earlier energy. By the end of the evening, attention focused less on marriage and more on what the invitation had revealed about intentions. Morning headlines replaced celebration. Articles discussed the unusual appearance at the ceremony and questioned Frank's motives for inviting his former wife. Interviews with past co-workers surfaced quickly. Some described his competitiveness as admirable. Others quietly mentioned projects where he claimed credit too easily or shifted blame when deals weakened. At the office, conversations paused when Frank entered. No accusations were spoken directly, yet distance formed. A junior analyst presented documentation showing an investment proposal originally developed by a colleague before Frank advanced it during promotion reviews. Management opened a formal inquiry, careful but serious. Frank insisted everything had been procedural, yet confidence in him weakened. Clients delayed meetings. Invitations stopped arriving. The admiration he once relied on proved dependent on perception. Without constant praise, his routines felt uncertain. He noticed how silence in a crowded office resembled the silence he once ignored at home. Caroline requested to meet privately in a quiet cafe, far from reporters and events. She spoke without anger, only clarity. She explained she admired ambition, but not the need to diminish others to prove success. The wedding incident revealed a part of him she had not examined before, the desire for comparison rather than partnership. Frank attempted explanation, claiming the invitation meant closure, yet the reasoning sounded hollow aloud. Caroline removed her ring gently and placed it on the table. She said she wanted a life built on confidence, not competition. Her decision was calm, leaving no argument to hold on to. When she left, Frank remained seated long after the coffee cooled. The cafe noise continued normally around him. For the first time he understood attention could not repair choices already made. The quiet was heavier than any confrontation. Professional consequences followed personal ones. The inquiry concluded with a formal demotion and transfer to a minor advisory role away from major clients. No scandal, only reduced trust. Colleagues treated him politely but without reliance. The office that once measured his worth by results now measured him by caution. His apartment felt larger and emptier. Evenings held no scheduled events, only the sound of distant traffic. He attempted familiar routines, gym sessions, tailored clothing, yet they lacked purpose without an audience. Achievements once pursued for admiration provided little comfort in private. One night he passed the old museum building where he had first met Sophia. Lights inside revealed new restoration work completed by another team. He watched briefly from outside, recognizing the place held meaning unrelated to recognition. He continued walking without entering. Far from the city, Sophia's restoration work gained attention after the wedding coverage revealed her profession. Communities requested assistance repairing historic housing rather than replacing it. With Richard's support, offered quietly through grants rather than publicity, a national restoration program formed, focusing on preserving affordable homes. Sophia coordinated architects, apprentices, and local volunteers across multiple towns. She traveled often but maintained the same habits: simple clothes, careful sketches, patient explanations. The project provided employment and preserved neighborhoods people feared losing. She measured success through occupied homes rather than headlines. Richard visited sites without ceremony whenever possible. He listened to residents' stories and helped occasionally with small tasks, keeping their life grounded. Their marriage remained mostly private, valued for companionship rather than attention. Years later, Frank read an article about restored coastal communities. A photograph showed Sophia beside the lighthouse, smiling naturally while explaining plans to students. The caption mentioned national recognition, but emphasized her dedication to ordinary spaces. He closed the article slowly. He understood then that success he chased depended on witnesses, while the peace she found existed without them. Regret arrived not as sharp pain, but as clear understanding. Some opportunities could not be recreated once replaced by pride. In the coastal town, evening settled quietly over the water. Sophia and Richard walked along the shore discussing future projects and small daily matters. Waves moved steadily against the rocks, unchanged by recognition. Their life continued calmly, not proving anything, simply lived. As this story comes to an end, remember that behind every luxury lies a truth few ever see. If this story moved you, support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Until the next unforgettable true story, stay inspired and stay curious.